Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Lawfare, Law as a Weapon of War, by Orde Kittrie, read by Brian P. Craig. Forward, by R. James Woolsey, Jr. My first introduction to international law was a class with Leon Lipson, a Yale professor who started the class with the following line: "This is the only class you'll take in law school in which there is a reasonable argument that the subject does not exist. The reason is that there is no sheriff." In the Wild West, the vacuum caused by the lack of a sheriff was often filled by self-appointed lawmen, also known as vigilantes. As one scholar of the period put it, self-constituted courts sprang up. Judge Colts who made their own law often graced the frontier bench. Juries were easily influenced by friends or intimidated by foes, and law enforcement lagged behind violation of the law. In addition, even when sheriffs did nominally exist, they were often not upstanding models of the rule of law. Wyatt Earp, Henry Plummer, and Bat Masterson, among others, served either simultaneously or alternately as lawmen and outlaws. Lawfare, Law as a Weapon of War by Orde Kittrie, provides a fascinating analysis of how the vacuum caused by the lack of a sheriff is playing out today in the international legal arena. Many of the resulting phenomena are reminiscent of the Wild West. Lawfare describes foreign courts claiming universal jurisdiction over crimes allegedly committed by U.S. officials in third countries. It also details the International Criminal Court, ICC, claiming its own form of jurisdiction over U.S. officials, notwithstanding the United States' refusal to join the ICC. In addition, decisions by such international organizations and tribunals as do exist are largely the result of popularity contests manifested by non-aligned movement bloc voting. Meanwhile, international laws are routinely violated by many governments and non-state actors. Many of the most egregious violators simultaneously seek to sit in judgment of others. For example, the UN Human Rights Council features many of the world's worst human rights abusers, including the governments of China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, hypocritically passing judgment on the human rights practices of governments with far better records. As Lawfare convincingly illustrates, law is today, for many current and potential U.S. adversaries, a very useful weapon, wielded to oppress dissidents domestically and advance policy objectives internationally. In a jurisdiction subject to the rule of law, law would serve as a relatively fixed check on power. In a country like China or Russia, or in the international arena, which lacks an upstanding sheriff, law serves as a malleable instrument of power. Focused as it is on the international arena, the book provides numerous, painstakingly documented examples of how, in recent decades, both other governments and non-state actors have increasingly altered and deployed law both to augment their own power and constrain that of the United States and its allies. However, while Lawfare does an outstanding job of diagnosing the role of law in the international arena, its greatest strength lies in its proposed antidotes, its balanced and practical recommendations for how the United States and its allies should respond. There are several options for how the United States and its allies might choose to deal with the absence of an upstanding sheriff and the fact that law-flouting rogue states and terrorists are today largely the source of international conflict. That is, that because of them, we still live, internationally, in a decidedly Hobbesian world. One approach might be to ignore our legal obligations as blithely as do our adversaries and potential adversaries. However, that would contribute to eroding the good that law does and could do in the international arena, and bring us down to the level of our opponents. Ignoring legal obligations would be beneath a country such as ours that prides itself on its values and commitment to the rule of law. Lawfare explicitly rejects such an approach. This book's recommended approach to lawfare, writes Kittrie, does not counsel violating either domestic or international law or, as with the torture memos, developing convoluted arguments as to how an unlawful or morally reprehensible course of action can be portrayed as lawful. A second approach is reflected in the reasoning of some in the United States and elsewhere who ignore the evidence that we live in a Hobbesian rather than a Lockean world, and who insist that the United States must behave as if the Taliban, Hamas, and China are all genteel members of a collegial social contract. Those who take the second approach focus on holding the United States and its allies to standards that go far beyond the requirements of international law, while ignoring clear-cut violations by our opponents. For example, Lawfare describes how various international bodies have ignored the illegality of the practice of militants attacking while dressed as civilians, or hiding and firing weapons in or near schools, houses of worship, homes, and other civilian buildings. Lawfare also rejects this second approach. The book also strikingly contrasts the white-glove, hyper-deferential practice of international law by the U.S. government with the pervasively instrumental and brass-knuckles approach to U.S. domestic law of attorneys within the United States. As an illustration of the latter, the book quotes Professor Robert W. Gordon's description of the advocacy ideal taught in U.S. law schools, as providing that while attorneys should not tell outright lies to judges or fabricate evidence, they may, and if it will serve their client's interest, must, exploit any gap, ambiguity, technicality, or loophole, any not obviously and totally implausible interpretation of the law or facts, even if the result is a failure to enforce the substantive law against its violators. Lawfare notes that it is surely a peculiarity of U.S. jurisprudence and its practicing attorneys that they, by and large, wield law more aggressively against each other than they do against the U.S.'s foreign adversaries. A third approach for how the United States and its allies might choose to deal with the absence of an upstanding sheriff in a Hobbesian world is that advocated by Kittrie in Lawfare. The book recommends that the United States and its allies comply with their legal obligations, while at the same time far more aggressively and creatively waging and defending against lawfare. In other words, deploying law as a weapon against our adversaries and countering their efforts to use it as a weapon against us. Kittrie makes a compelling case for the benefits of this third approach. His book provides numerous remarkable examples of how U.S. private sector attorneys and occasionally U.S. government lawyers have already impactfully waged lawfare against U.S. adversaries. In light of the significant impact of lawfare waged by U.S. actors outside of the federal executive branch, listeners will be surprised to learn that the U.S. executive branch is itself largely failing to wage lawfare as systematically as are some of our adversaries. For example, the book describes how the People's Republic of China has adopted lawfare as a major component of its strategic doctrine, and is waging it aggressively and systematically across the maritime, aviation, space, cyber, and non-proliferation arenas. Indeed, while this is the first English-language book to provide an overview of lawfare, the Chinese People's Liberation Army has already published several such books. Having worked for more than 2 decades as a private sector litigator, I found of particular interest the book's several case studies of impactful lawfare waged by private sector litigators. The most fascinating may be Kittrie's description and analysis of how private sector litigators won a judgment against Iran and have seized some $2 billion in Iranian assets on behalf of the families of the 241 U.S. Marines killed in the 1983 Marine barracks bombing. As the book discusses, the U.S. executive branch never retaliated against Iran for the attack, despite quickly acquiring strong evidence that the attack had been orchestrated by Iran. A plan to respond by bombing an Iranian base in Lebanon was developed but never implemented. In 1994, more than a decade after the Marine barracks bombing, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger insisted that we never had the fidelity on who perpetrated that horrendous act. George Shultz, who was Secretary of State at the time, later criticized the lack of a response, stating, "We may never have the kind of evidence that can stand up in an American court of law, but we cannot allow ourselves to become the Hamlet of nations, worrying endlessly over whether and how to respond." As the book describes, it was, ironically, in an American court of law, on May 30th, 2003, almost 20 years after the blast, that Iran was finally held accountable for the Marine barracks bombing. On that day, a U.S. District Court judge ruled that Iran was responsible for the Marine barracks bombing and awarded $2.657 billion in compensation to its victims. In 2008, $2 billion in Iranian assets were seized as a result of the verdict. For despots, taking their money away can be more important than dropping a few bombs and killing a few of their citizens, about whom they may not care very much, said Steve Perlis, an American private sector lawyer who represented the plaintiffs in the Marine barracks bombing case. The book goes on to provide a thoughtful analysis of why so much of the United States' most effective and creative lawfare is being waged not by the U.S. government, but rather by private sector or other non-governmental attorneys. Kittrie describes how economic globalization, the information technology revolution, and the continued rigidity of the U.S. government bureaucracy have all in recent decades increased the ease and likelihood of effective ideas and implementation emerging from private sector and other non-governmental practitioners of lawfare, rather than from government attorneys. Kittrie quotes John Hamre, a former Deputy Secretary of Defense who became head of CSIS, a Washington, D.C. think tank, putting it simply, big bureaucracies do not invent new ideas. He also quotes Michelle Flournoy, a former U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, recently questioning whether the United States' national security decision-making processes are agile enough and responsive enough to keep pace with the speed of the modern world. Sometimes it feels, said Flournoy, like our interagency process is horribly slow and clunky compared to the demands being placed on it from the environment. Having served in the federal government in 4 different administrations, I am not unfamiliar with bureaucratic frustrations. As chairman of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I have enjoyed the opportunity to advise and participate in its efforts to nimbly develop and implement or encourage implementation of creative new ideas for lawfare against U.S. adversaries. 2 of the organization's success stories regarding Iranian gasoline imports and Iranian dependence on the SWIFT, Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications Financial Transaction System, are detailed in this book, alongside similar case studies of creative lawfare waged by other NGOs. As a former general counsel to the Senate Armed Services Committee, I also found very interesting the book's description of the tensions over private sector lawfare between the executive branch, which mostly considers it a bothersome interference in its foreign policy prerogatives, and Congress, which keeps passing new laws facilitating private sector litigation against state sponsors of terrorism and the like. As one analyst put it, who could vote against the belief in the law as the ultimate arbitrator of social justice, the reliance on the rights and energies of the individual, the emotional and moral draw of the common man taking on a dictatorial terrorist state in a courtroom showdown? The book explains that notwithstanding the Supreme Court's ruling in the recent case of Zivotofsky versus Kerry, the idea that the president speaks for the nation with one voice in dealing with other governments does not square with either the Constitution or U.S. practice. Aside from Congress exercising the considerable foreign policy powers provided to it in the Constitution, there is an extensive record of U.S. states, cities, and non-governmental actors undertaking lawfare-type actions to influence U.S. foreign policy. These and other deployments of lawfare are wonderfully described in this thoroughly researched, thought-provoking, and compellingly readable book. Lawfare is both an invaluable work of scholarship and also a vitally important call to action. Both the U.S. government and the broader American legal community contain tremendous legal expertise. Their failure to engage with lawfare systematically, while our adversaries and potential adversaries are doing so, is a missed opportunity and is increasingly dangerous. U.S. and allied policymakers and lawyers should listen to this important book and heed its call to action. Chapter 1. A conceptual overview of lawfare's meaning, variety, and power. Lawfare is the strategy of using or misusing law as a substitute for traditional military means to achieve a war-fighting objective. Major General Charles J. Dunlap, Jr., United States Air Force, retired. Law is becoming an increasingly powerful and prevalent weapon of war. The reasons for this development include the increased number and reach of international laws and tribunals, the rise of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, focused on law of armed conflict and related issues, the information technology revolution, and the advance of globalization and thus economic interdependence. The following are 4 recent illustrative examples of lawfare, the use of law as a weapon of war. Palestinian Authority PA President Mahmoud Abbas wrote in a 2011 New York Times op-ed that UN recognition of Palestine as a member state would pave the way for the internationalization of the conflict as a legal matter, not only a political one. It would also pave the way for us to pursue claims against Israel at the United Nations, human rights treaty bodies, and the International Court of Justice. Since then, the PA has joined dozens of international treaties and organizations, including the International Criminal Court. In addition, Palestinian and allied NGOs have filed lawsuits and instigated criminal prosecutions in Europe against companies accused of aiding alleged Israeli war crimes by supplying Israel with security technology or construction equipment. Some of these companies have felt compelled to stop doing business with Israel. As the PA advanced its lawfare strategy, the Israeli government became so concerned that it decided to trade the release of dozens of Palestinian prisoners who had murdered Israelis in exchange for a 9-month respite from PA lawfare. Thus, the Palestinian Authority has begun to win by internationalization of the conflict as a legal matter what it could not achieve through either armed force or negotiations. A Russian ship, the MV Aleid, was at sea in June 2012 carrying helicopter gunships bound for Syria's Assad regime. The UK wished to stop the shipment, but understood that forcibly intercepting a Russian ship could have risked World War III. So the UK persuaded the ship's insurer, London's Standard Club, to withdraw the ship's insurance. As a result, the ship and its deadly cargo turned around and returned to Russia. The People's Republic of China, PRC, has explicitly adopted legal warfare as a major component of its strategic doctrine and is currently waging it in the maritime, aviation, space, cyber, and other arenas. For example, China has, according to 2 U.S. Navy attorneys, recently begun to engage in a resourceful legal warfare or lawfare strategy to deny access to its coastal seas to warships and aircraft of the United States, Japan, and other countries in the region. A Naval War College professor calls this part of China's ongoing lawfare strategy to misstate or misapply international legal norms to accommodate its anti-access strategy. According to another U.S. Navy lawyer, China's maritime lawfare strategy is slowly proving effective. If successful, China will have achieved through the use of lawfare what it traditionally would have had to achieve almost solely through military force. The Taliban have regularly placed military assets within or around schools, religious sites, and hospitals in hopes of either deterring attacks or, if attacks do take place, accusing the United States and its allies of harming innocent civilians. In response, the United States and its allies have adopted targeting standards more stringent than required by international law. As U.S. Major General Charles Dunlap, Jr. put it, NATO's creation of restrictions beyond what is required by international law creates for its adversary a substitute for conventional military weaponry. For the Taliban to survive, it is not necessary for them to build conventional air defenses. Rather, just by operating amidst civilians, they enjoy a legal sanctuary that is as secure as any fortress bristling with anti-aircraft guns. In recognition of law's increasing utility as a weapon of war, Dunlap, then a colonel in the United States Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps, in November 2001, introduced the term lawfare into the mainstream legal and international relations literature. He ultimately defined lawfare as the strategy of using or misusing law as a substitute for traditional military means to achieve an operational objective. Despite the term having been coined by a U.S. government official, the U.S. government has only sporadically engaged with the concept of lawfare. It has no lawfare strategy or doctrine, and no office or interagency mechanism that systematically develops or coordinates U.S. offensive lawfare or U.S. defenses against lawfare. In contrast, the People's Republic of China, PRC, has adopted the similarly defined concept of legal warfare as a major component of its strategic doctrine. In addition, law has become a preeminent weapon in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, leading the Israeli government to create an office focused on waging and defending against lawfare. The U.S. government's lack of systematic engagement with lawfare is a tremendous missed opportunity. Lawfare is not going to entirely or even largely replace traditional kinetic warfare, shooting warfare. However, many of this book's case studies of impactful lawfare demonstrate that lawfare, deployed systematically and adeptly, could in various circumstances save U.S. and foreign lives by enabling U.S. national security objectives to be advanced with less or no kinetic warfare. Lawfare is almost always less deadly than traditional warfare. We have every reason to embrace lawfare, says Philip Carter, an attorney and former U.S. Army officer, for it is vastly preferable to the bloody, expensive, and destructive forms of warfare that ravaged the world in the 20th century. As Carter Riley puts it, I would far prefer to have motions and discovery requests fired at me than incoming mortar or rocket-propelled grenade fire. Lawfare is almost always less financially costly than traditional warfare. Lawfare is thus a weapon eminently suitable for the U.S. public's aversion to casualties and the current U.S. focus on reducing government spending. Lawfare can sometimes also be more effective than kinetic warfare. For despots, taking their money away can be more important than dropping a few bombs and killing a few of their citizens, about whom they may not care very much, said Steve Perlis, an American civil litigator who has, as described in Chapter 3, collected hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. court judgments against state sponsors of terrorism. In addition, if some portion of warfare can be shifted from kinetic combat to the legal arena, that should be to the United States' great advantage. While the United States does have more sophisticated lethal weapons than do its adversaries, its advantage in sophisticated legal weapons has the potential to be even greater. The United States is a far more law-oriented society, with a much higher percentage of its best minds going into the legal field and creatively using law to achieve their objectives than is, say, the PRC. Yet the PRC is currently waging lawfare much more diligently and systematically than is the United States. Despite lawfare's advantages over traditional warfare, little scholarly attention has been paid to lawfare thus far. This is the first English-language book to provide a broad and systematic overview of lawfare, defined here, as Dunlap defines it, as the strategy of using or misusing law as a substitute for traditional military means to achieve a war-fighting objective. This chapter, Chapter 1, analyzes lawfare conceptually. Section 1 of this chapter addresses the definition of lawfare, provides a brief overview of previous lawfare scholarship, and then discusses this book's goals, structure, and methodology. Section 2 of this chapter offers a lawfare typology. Section 3 provides an overview of the U.S. approach to lawfare thus far. Section 4, the final section of this chapter, analyzes why lawfare's impact and prevalence are increasing. Each of this book's 7 subsequent chapters focuses on lawfare waged by a distinct actor or set of actors. U.S. NGOs and individuals, Chapter 2, the U.S. government, Chapter 3, the PRC, Chapter 4, the PA, Chapter 5, Palestinian NGOs and their allies, Chapter 6, Hamas, Chapter 7, and Israel, Chapter 8. Each of these chapters uses case studies and other data to describe and analyze how and why lawfare has been waged, and what the consequences have been for the wagers of lawfare, their adversaries, and other affected parties. Chapters 2, 3, 4, 7, and 8 each conclude with a discussion of lessons learned and an assessment of how lawfare by the respective actor or set of actors may develop in the future. For chapters 5 and 6 together, the discussion of lessons learned and potential future lawfare is contained at the conclusion of Chapter 6. The book's conclusion highlights key opportunities for next steps in the study of lawfare, including by suggesting some ways in which future lawfare research could inform legal and international relations scholarship and vice versa. 1. The meaning and study of lawfare. A. The origins and definition of lawfare. While the concept of law as a weapon of war was first termed lawfare in an essay by Charles Dunlap, Jr. in November 2001, both the concept and the term pre-existed Dunlap.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?